Alexa Ayala has a new enemy and women's tennis may never feel the same again. Because this season didn't just shift rankings, it shifted energy. And it didn't begin with trash talk but with a look across the net, a moment nobody expected that quietly turned a rising star's fairytale into something far more complicated. A Filipina teenager who was never supposed to be here, never supposed to carry the hopes of an entire nation on her shoulders, stepped onto professional courts not as just another prospect but as history in motion. From junior Grand Slam success to fearless performances against higher-ranked opponents, she didn't play respectful tennis. She played to win. She fought from behind, absorbed pressure, redirected momentum. And slowly the world stopped watching out of curiosity and started believing. Philippines rallied behind her with flags, chants, emotion, and pride rarely seen in tennis, turning her matches into events, turning her presence into something powerful. But attention always brings scrutiny, and soon opponents noticed the crowds, umpires noticed the atmosphere. Analysts began questioning whether passion had crossed into pressure. Yet Ella remained calm, grounded, respectful in interviews until she stopped being a surprise and started being a threat. And threats don't make friends. Because it only took one match, one night, one comeback where tension boiled over, where long rallies, tight margins, disputed calls, frustrated gestures, and emotional pressure built toward a finish that felt bigger than tennis itself. A defiant celebration, a cold handshake, subtle complaints afterward about fairness and crowd influence that didn't name her directly but said enough. Splitting the tennis world overnight, fueling debates, igniting social media, turning every replay, every glance, every fist pump into evidence for one side or the other. Supporters defending her as a young woman finally allowed to be expressive. Critics accusing her of changing the sport's unwritten rules. Pundits warning that love can be as dangerous as hate. And suddenly Alexa Ayala wasn't just winning matches anymore. She was changing the room, becoming polarizing, becoming a lightning rod, with every future match carrying more tension, colder crowds, sharper opponents, heavier scrutiny. Yet she kept training. Kept evolving, kept responding with discipline instead of drama, learning to channel emotion without erasing herself, because the truth is she never asked to be controversial. She simply competed with passion in a space that wasn't used to seeing someone like her succeed loudly, proudly, unapologetically. And maybe her new enemy was never one opponent at all but resistance to change itself, the discomfort that comes when tradition is challenged, when new identity enters an old structure. When belief becomes visible, when presence becomes undeniable, and whether this rivalry fades or follows her for years, the impact is already here. Young players are watching, fans are invested. The sport is being forced to confront uncomfortable questions about expression, fairness, and evolution, because rivalries don't begin with insults, they begin when someone refuses to step aside, and Alexa Ayala has made one thing clear: she isn't stepping aside, she has arrived. And women's tennis is already different because of it. And the story doesn't end there, because arrival is only the first chapter of a legacy, and what comes next is always the most dangerous part. The part where expectations grow heavier than applause, where every win is demanded instead of celebrated, and every loss is dissected instead of understood. Where the world stops asking who you are and starts demanding who you must become. And that is the pressure Alexa Ayala now walks into every single time she steps onto court. Not as an underdog anymore, but as a symbol, as a disruptor, as a player people prepare for differently, study differently, emotionally react to differently, because the energy around her has changed, the air in stadiums has changed, the conversations in locker rooms have changed, and that shift is impossible to reverse once it begins. Because now opponents don't just want to beat her, some want to silence her moment, some want to prove a point. Some want to take back control of a narrative that no longer belongs to them, and that's what makes this phase so defining. Because greatness is not built in the season where you surprise everyone. It's built in the seasons where everyone is waiting for you to fail, waiting for you to crack, waiting for you to apologize for being too loud, too proud, too different, too present. And yet every time she keeps walking forward, keeps adjusting, keeps growing. Keeps learning the politics of the sport without surrendering the heart that brought her here. And slowly something remarkable begins to happen. Because the same controversy that once threatened to box her and starts to carve her out into something bigger, something undeniable, something necessary, the kind of player young girls see and recognize themselves in, the kind of competitor that forces institutions to adapt rather than asking permission to exist, and whether the rivalry intensifies or dissolves. Whether the critics soften or grow louder, whether the cheers become universal or remain divided, one truth keeps expanding with every tournament, every match, every moment of pressure she survives: that this isn't a temporary wave. This is a shift in the current, and players like Alexa Ayala don't just participate in eras. They define them, because history doesn't remember who made everyone comfortable. It remembers who changed the atmosphere, who challenged the expectations, who carried something bigger than themselves onto the court and refused to put it down. And as the season stretches forward and the stakes grow higher, the question is no longer whether she belongs here. That question has already been answered. The real question now is how much of the sport will change because she does. And the longer this journey stretches, the clearer it becomes that this moment in her career is not about noise or narratives, but about endurance. Because influence is tested not in one breakthrough season, but in the seasons that follow, when fatigue creeps in, when motivation has to be rebuilt week after week, when travel, losses, injuries, criticism, and loneliness begin to stack up in ways no highlight reel ever shows. And yet this is where the real separation happens. Because players who are only fueled by hype fade when the cameras drift, while players fueled by purpose keep grinding when no one is watching. And that is the space Alexa Ayala is now entering. A space where discipline matters more than momentum, where maturity matters more than emotion, where consistency matters more than potential, and every practice session, every early morning recovery, every film session, every adjustment to her serve, her footwork. Her shot selection becomes part of a quiet transformation that outsiders don't see but opponents eventually feel. Because suddenly the player they once thought they could outlast starts outlasting them. The player they once thought would fold under hostility starts thriving in it. The player they once dismissed as crowd-powered starts winning in silence too. And that evolution is the most threatening of all, because it removes every excuse, every narrative, every justification, leaving only one uncomfortable. She belongs fully, undeniably, without conditions, without asterisk, without apology, and as her game deepens, as her composure sharpens, as her experience compounds, the conversations around her begin to change again, not because the drama disappears, but because respect grows heavier than controversy. Because analysts start pointing to patterns instead of moments, to resilience instead of reaction, to growth instead of hype. And that's when something even more powerful happens. Because the younger generation watching from the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, from countries that have never seen themselves represented at the top of tennis, begin to recalibrate what they believe is possible. They begin picking up rackets not just with dreams but with evidence, with proof that someone who looks like them, sounds like them, carries their flag, can stand on the biggest courts in the world and not ask for permission to be there. And that kind of impact stretches far beyond one rivalry. One season, one ranking, because that is how movements begin, quietly, through visibility, through persistence, through refusal to shrink. And whether the tennis establishment fully embraces her or continues to resist her presence, history will record the same truth either way, that this era shifted because one player arrived with belief loud enough to be heard across continents and disciplines strong enough to survive the backlash. And as the chapters continue to unfold, as new matches bring new tests, new opponents bring new tensions, new opportunities bring new pressure, the question keeps evolving, no longer about whether Alexa Ayala will fade or endure, but about how far this influence will stretch, how many doors will open because she refused to stay small, and how many stories will begin because hers proved that arrival is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of transformation. Even beyond the courts, the ripple effects continue to expand, because what's happening around Alexa Ayala is no longer contained within scorelines or tournament brackets. It's happening in conversations, in academies, in living rooms, in young players' minds who are now training with a different kind of fire. Not just dreaming of success, but visualizing representation, seeing a pathway that didn't exist before, and that matters more than trophies ever could in the early stages of a legacy. Because legacy is built on what survives when the spotlight moves on, and Ayala's presence is already reshaping expectations in places the tennis world rarely pays attention to. With federations taking notice, sponsorship opportunities increasing, grassroots programs gaining traction, and families who never considered tennis as a viable pursuit now reconsidering what their children might be capable of. And this is the uncomfortable power of someone who changes the narrative simply by existing at a high level. Because institutions move slowly, traditions resist disruption, but momentum built from belief spreads faster than any official endorsement ever could. And while critics continue to debate tone, crowds, and etiquette, the scoreboard keeps delivering the same quiet message, match after match, that she is not a moment. She is a presence, not a storyline, but a fixture. Fixtures force adjustment. They force opponents to prepare differently. They force media to cover differently. They force organizers to market differently. And gradually the ecosystem bends around them whether it wants to or not. And that bending is what signals real impact. Because temporary hype never changes systems, but sustained excellence does. And Ayala is now approaching that threshold where excellence becomes expectation, where she's no longer graded on potential but on performance. No longer protected by novelty but challenged by ambition. And that transition is the most dangerous phase of any rising career, because it demands emotional maturity as much as technical growth. It demands patience when progress plateaus, humility when wins stack up, and resilience when inevitable setbacks arrive. And so far, everything about how she has handled the pressure suggests she understands that she's not chasing headlines but building foundations. Not reacting to narratives but refining her process. And that is why this story refuses to fade, because it is not sustained by controversy. It is sustained by consistency, by evolution, by a slow but undeniable accumulation of proof. And the more proof she gathers, the harder it becomes for the tennis world to dismiss her as an anomaly. The harder it becomes to frame her as a disruption rather than an arrival. And eventually the language will shift completely. From rising star to established contender, from polarizing figure to defining presence, from storyline to standard. And when that happens, people will look back at this moment, this first tension, this first rivalry, this first wave of discomfort, and recognize it for what it truly was, not a problem, not a controversy, but the unmistakable signal that the balance of the sport had begun to move. And as that balance continues to shift, the narrative around Alexa Ayala transforms from speculation into inevitability. Because the more time passes, the more undeniable her trajectory becomes, and trajectories don't lie the way headlines sometimes do. They are built on hours, on patterns, on repetition, on the kind of consistency that can't be faked or manufactured. And this is where her story truly separates from ordinary breakout arcs, because many players arrive with hype. But very few remain when the novelty fades, when the attention becomes heavy, when expectations harden into pressure. And yet Ayala remains not louder, not flashier, but sharper, more disciplined, more grounded in who she is becoming as both a competitor and a person. Which is why the early controversy now feels less like a stain and more like a catalyst, the moment that forced her to evolve faster, to toughen mentally. To understand the politics of the sport while still protecting the purity of her game. And that kind of accelerated growth is rare, because most young players are sheltered from it. While she was thrown directly into it and chose not to retreat but to adapt, to refine, to continue showing up match after match with the same hunger and deeper composure. And that's why opponents are no longer just wary of her forehand or her movement, but of her presence. Because presence changes the rhythm of matches before the first ball is even struck. Presence forces doubt, forces tension, forces awareness. And when a player reaches that point, they are no longer simply participating in the tour, they are shaping it. And this is where the idea of a new enemy becomes almost irrelevant. Because rivalries evolve, opponents change, storylines shift, but what remains constant is impact. And Ayala's impact is no longer tied to one handshake, one match, or one moment of tension. It is tied to the way the sport now reacts to her existence, to the way crowds lean in when she walks on court, to the way young fans now say her name as a reference point for what they want to become, to the way analysts now build conversations around her rather than around those trying to stop her. And that is the clearest marker of arrival, because true arrival is not when everyone loves you. It is when everyone has to account for you, and at this stage of her journey. That's exactly what is happening. The tennis world is adjusting, consciously or unconsciously, to the reality that Alexa Ayala is not passing through. She is not a phase, she is not a temporary spark. She is a force settling into place, shaping a new emotional texture for the game, a new cultural footprint, a new standard of representation. And whether future seasons bring titles, heartbreak, dominance, or adversity, the foundation has already been laid for something larger than wins and losses. Because influence like this does not disappear, it multiplies, it echoes. It outlives rivalries and narratives and controversies. And when the story of this era is eventually told, the beginning will not be traced to a trophy or a ranking, but to the moment a young Filipina player stepped onto the stage, refused to shrink, absorbed the resistance, grew through the pressure, and quietly, steadily changed the direction of the conversation, leaving the sport no choice but to evolve around her.